So in this video, we're going to talk about why most people completely misunderstand China's semiconductor ecosystem. If you go out and ask people why China has become such a dominant force in manufacturing, the answers are usually very predictable. Cheap labor, government subsidies, scale, speed. And to be fair, none of those are completely wrong. But after spending years inside China's semiconductor advanced manufacturing ecosystem, working with suppliers, engineers, equipment companies, and material providers, and honestly spending far too much time on WeChat than I ever planned, I have come to a more nuanced conclusion. China's real advantage is ecosystem density. And one of my friends once said something that stuck with me. At first, it was just a good laugh, but over time I started realizing he might be right. Same clowns, different circus. Then he looked at me and said, but in semiconductors, it's the same clowns, but different circuits. Which sound funny at first, until you actually spend enough time in the industry. Then it starts sounding pretty accurate. But I think the deeper question is not whether people are copying. It's why does the ecosystem produce so many similar looking companies in the first place? So the question becomes, is copying the real story? When outsiders look at China's semiconductor ecosystem, they often see dozens of suppliers offering what looks like the same product. Same specifications, same websites, same product photos, sometimes even the same English phrasing, which is oddly consistent across competitors. And the immediate assumption is, they are just copying each other. And yes, copying does exist, but that's not the interesting part. The more important question is, do they understand what they're copying and who's the real player? Let me give you a simple example. Anyone can copy the dimension of a chair. Height, width, angle, materials. That's the easy part. But understanding why the chair is designed that way is completely different. Why the seat height matters for posture. Why the back angle reduces fatigue. Why one material survives stress over time while the other fails early. That is design understanding. And in China's semiconductor ecosystem, you see the same split. A lot of companies can replicate what exists. They can copy parts, a process, even a full category. But copying is the only starting point. The companies that actually survive are the ones that move from copying to understanding. They start learning through iteration, because there's where you can answer questions like why the process works, where it fails, what customers actually care about, and how to improve it. And this is why from the outside China looks chaotic, because on paper 10 suppliers look identical, but in reality they are not. And this is also where many foreign companies run into challenges. Because at first contact, especially at trade shows or exhibitions, you're often speaking with a front layer of organization, like a young salesperson who just got into the industry trying to reach his sales target, living paycheck to paycheck. So you may not necessarily encounter the technical or decision layer. And that's the difference that can easily lead to misinterpretation if you assume you're already seeing the full picture. Now let's talk about why foreign companies misread the market. Alright, let's say you are a foreign semiconductor company that tries to source something from China. Let's say maybe a wafer, a machine part, or a component. So it does what feels natural. You go find suppliers online, send emails, ask for specs, drawings, pricing, lead times, and then nothing. Or they get a very generic reply that doesn't really answer the technical questions. So the conclusion becomes, these suppliers don't understand what we need. But that's often not the real issue. The real issue is the mental model, because many foreign companies treat China like a catalog market. But in many industrial sectors here, especially in semiconductors, it doesn't work like that. It starts with relationships, not transactions. It starts with introductions, and very often it starts on WeChat, face-to-face offline meetings, and even better, tea parties, not emails. And once you're inside that network, things can change very quickly, because a supplier doesn't just introduce you to a product, he introduces you to an ecosystem, a network of connections. You may ask about one silicon carbide supplier, and suddenly you get the graphite supplier, the coating supplier, the machining shop, the vacuum system guy, the equipment manufacturer, and somehow the founder of another company just 2 industrial parks away. At some point, it stops feeling like sourcing and starts feeling like accidentally joining a supply chain group chat that you didn't ask for. That's ecosystem density. And yes, if you ever get invited for tea, you should probably clear your calendar. That's not a coffee chat, that's the system upgrade. And here is the layer nobody sees. Because if you dig deeper and do your homework correctly, not using Google, but using Chinese apps like 天眼查、企查查、爱企查、国家企业信用信息公示系统, you realize something interesting. Not every company is what it looks like on paper. Some companies generally manufacture, some are trading companies, some outsource part of production, some are simply components sourced from multiple factories, and sometimes the export company and the manufacturing company are completely different entities. So what looks like 10 suppliers might actually be 3 real manufacturers and 7 layers of intermediaries. And this is why evaluation from abroad becomes so difficult. Because if you're sitting thousands of kilometers away relying on websites, Google, PDFs, and email exchanges, you're only seeing the surface layer, not the real truth. And in China, the surface layer is almost never the full story. And then there's a completely different layer in China's industrial system, the ecosystem builders. Take BOE Technology Group as an example. Most people know BOE as a display company, screens, panels, consumer electronics. But what's less discussed is its founder, Wang Dongsheng, didn't just step away and retired quietly. Instead, he moved into semiconductors and became involved with ESWIN Technology Group. And ESWIN is now active in chips, computing, and advanced semiconductor materials, including RISC-V related development. So you have a founder moving from display into semiconductor infrastructure. That's not diversification, that is ecosystem building. And then there's Huawei, as we all know of. Most people still think of Huawei as a telecom company, but on the ground it's much broader. Cloud, AI, automotive electronics, chips, and increasingly semiconductor ecosystem development through partnerships and industrial initiatives like Sea Carrier. And if you're really embedded into one or another ecosystem, you realize that if you want to become a supplier of Huawei, for instance, maybe one of the requirements is that you have to use their equipment from the partnership they have created with Sea Carrier, Xinkailai. The conclusion is, and what's important is this, these companies don't just participate in ecosystems, they actively shape them, they bring in suppliers, they coordinate development, they create long-term industrial alignment. And once you are inside one of these ecosystems, something subtle happens. Trust increases, not because of marketing, but because of the ecosystem signal itself tells the market, we are not temporary, we are structurally embedded. And in industrial markets, that signal matters more than most people realize. So here's the thing. When people ask me why China has so many semiconductor suppliers, I don't think the answer is simply copying. And to be fair, that answer isn't entirely wrong either. Copying does exist, but it's only the entry point. What matters is what happens after that, because in China thousands of companies can start from the same copied baseline. But only a small group moves from replication to understanding and into the actual ecosystem participation. And that's where the real separation happens. It's not about who can copy the fastest, it's about who can understand deeply enough to plug into the ecosystem and evolve it. And in the end, those are usually companies that don't just survive the cycle, they help define the next one. And I sometimes think about how we in the West we look at the ecosystem thinking, like how companies such as Tesla, SpaceX, and XAI are being connected, and we see it as highly strategic integration. But in China, similar ecosystem structures often exist too. They are just less visible from outside and therefore often misunderstood. And that's usually where the surprises come from. Not because they appear suddenly, but because we weren't looking at the ecosystem in the first place.